Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Palm Beach, Mar-a-Lago, and the Rise of America's Xanadu by Les Standiford, narrated by John Mclain. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1798. Author's Note. Aside from the White House, there may be no more prominent private residence in the United States than Mar-a-Lago, the nearly 18-acre Florida estate spanning southerly Palm Beach Island from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to Lake Worth on the west. Mar-a-Lago, designed by Joseph Urban and built between 1924 and 1927 by serial empire heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post, contains 115 rooms in its main buildings and covers 62,500 square feet. It cost about $8 million to build, which equates to somewhere between $160 million and upwards of $1.5 billion currently, depending on whose conversion figures are used. Admittedly, there are more expansive mansions to be found. The Biltmore Estate, near Asheville, North Carolina, built in 1895 by George Washington Vanderbilt II, is said to be the nation's largest, with well more than twice the square footage of Mar-a-Lago. And perhaps nearly as famed is Hearst Castle, the former home of William Randolph Hearst, completed in 1947 and dominating a mountaintop near San Simeon, California. Hearst Castle comprises 68,500 square feet and ranks 17th in size to Mar-a-Lago's 20th, which is just ahead of The Breakers, the getaway built by Cornelius Vanderbilt in Newport, Rhode Island, covering 62,482 square feet. But size and dollars alone are not what set Mar-a-Lago apart. The others mentioned are known today primarily as museums and tourist attractions, even the Biltmore Estate, which remains in the hands of Vanderbilt descendants. Mar-a-Lago continues its use as a residence, and for all the days of its history, it has held the attention of the public because of those who have lived there, why they have chosen to live there, and what goes on within those formidable walls. Notably, even those who have chosen not to take up residence at Mar-a-Lago, and their reasons for turning down the opportunity, have consumed the attention of the nation's citizenry and its media, fomenting debate in both houses of Congress and demanding the attention of several U.S. presidents long before the current lord of the manor arrived. As it approaches its 100th anniversary, Mar-a-Lago has assumed a stature in the collective consciousness far larger than its physical bounds. Even on the relatively small island of Palm Beach, 18 miles long, and anywhere from 500 feet to 3/4 of a mile wide, any number of grand domiciles and structures remain, including the still-standing Whitehall, the meticulously restored 75-room, 60,000-square-foot former home of Palm Beach founder Henry Flagler, as well as still-lived-in homes built for the Kennedys, the DuPonts, and many other social luminaries. Also standing are the ornate 538-room Breakers Hotel, restyled by Italian craftsmen in 1926 after Rome's Via Medici, the sprawling other-era Bath and Tennis Club, another Joseph Urban creation, and the fabled Everglades Club, the Paris singer/Addison Misner undertaking that sparked the island's emergence as the favored winter retreat for the ultra-privileged. But none of those comprises the character of Palm Beach to the extent that Mar-a-Lago does. Mentioning Mar-a-Lago to a European, for instance, conveys an immense amount of cultural information instantaneously. This writer has experienced the same phenomenon only once before, during a tour of the continent in the 1980s. All it took to dissolve cultural and linguistic barriers, even in the most forlorn hamlet, was the mention of Miami. "Ah, Miami," The listener would respond, puzzlement vanished, hand and forefinger quickly forming the universal likeness of a pistol. "Bang, bang! Miami Vice, ha ha!" Fabulous Mar-a-Lago was from the beginning the perfect centerpiece for the community it anchors, a modern-day Xanadu, symbolizing wealth and privilege and exclusivity. Unlike other retreats for the ultra-fortunate, Palm Beach has been in existence for a relatively short time, having taken its shape over the course of little more than a century. And, unlike Newport or the Hamptons or Palm Springs, Palm Beach is relatively far-flung, having become what it is in a place where there previously was nothing but sand and sea and sky, located at the time of its founding in literal terra incognita. Furthermore, what has taken place at Mar-a-Lago and in Palm Beach redefines our very concept of class distinction in the United States. There may have been a time when one demonstrated the blueness of one's blood by tracing the family lineage back to the Mayflower or to the Revolutionary War, but at about the same time that the walls were going up around the great estates on the island of Palm Beach, qualifications as to who really mattered here began to change. In the early years of the 20th century, those who had assembled vast fortunes during the country's Gilded Age began to make their own claims to importance and distinction. And, along with ducal wealth, celebrity also became a new imprimatur of consequence. Beyond such considerations, however, there is a distinctly human dimension to this story, for the high walls of Mar-a-Lago and other mansions like it were seemingly designed to contain scandal within as much as keep intruders out. Even the likes of Henry Flagler and Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, Marjorie Merriweather Post and E.F. Hutton, Joseph Kennedy and his many heirs, Douglas MacArthur, and on, were not immune to the lapses common to humankind, even if some residents would prefer it otherwise. "There are certain things that are simply not discussed in public here," explains one longtime Palm Beacher. This preference not to be in the news goes beyond avoidance of scandal. When Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, began to refer to Mar-a-Lago as the Winter White House, no chorus of communal pride arose. In the 1950s, Key West residents might have celebrated the visits of Harry Truman to his Winter White House as he proclaimed his quarters on their rock. But for many in Palm Beach, and never mind his sometimes simpatico politics, the glare of the spotlight that Trump's presence brought has been as much bane as blessing. For this writer, what follows is an attempt to trace the record of an improbable dream of wealth and privilege carried from hand to hand, slowly working its way into shape, tempered by the intrigues of jealousy, greed, and the perpetual thirst for control. It is the tale of how an unlikely place was born from nothing, and how that place in turn spawned the perfect domicile to represent and nourish it. Flagranti. When Marjorie Merriweather Post and E.F. Hutton completed the building of their signature Palm Beach mansion in 1927, it was considered a landmark achievement. Even in that otherworldly retreat for the ultra-privileged, there had been nothing like exotic Mar-a-Lago, Spanish for sea to lake, since the original mansion on the island, Henry Flagler's Whitehall, was constructed in 1902. But Whitehall was cool, elegant, and patrician, a 75-room model of classical dignity designed by architects Carrere and Hastings in the Beaux-Arts style, and meant to remind visitors of traditional bastions of privilege in Newport and other northern retreats. Mar-a-Lago was something of a fever dream, equal parts Mediterranean revival and set designer fantasy, where architectural dicta gave way often to passion and fancy. Who would have expected otherwise when the architect was Ziegfeld Folly's mastermind, Joseph Urban? Passion and fancy might have been the motto emblazoned on the couple's marital crest, in fact, for there was plenty of that trailing like fairy dust in their singular wake. She was heiress to the Postum Cereal Company fortune and one of the richest women in the world. He, the mastermind of one of the largest brokerage houses in the country. Mar-a-Lago was a physical manifestation of their union, an enormous, impossible creation where a simple visit was an exercise in transcending the ordinary. In those times, and in that place, there may have seemed no better purpose for their vast fortunes. Hutton and Merriweather had met at the outset of the Roaring Twenties, he a widower, her first marriage a loveless exercise in escape from adolescence, and for a time theirs had seemed the ideal union, two larger-than-life individuals for whom sparks flew upon the instant of their meeting, and who lit up the social scene of New York and Palm Beach in a way that made Scott and Zelda seem ordinary. But a number of things had changed. They had met when she was 33 and he a decade older. Now she was approaching 50 and Hutton was almost 60. And while she was trending toward the matronly, he retained his dashing good looks and, so it was said, his eye for an attractive woman. Marjorie had been made aware of the rumors that she at first dismissed as cattiness, as anyone in her position might well have. As a stout adherent of Christian Science philosophy, she was resolutely patient with Ned Hutton, whom she continued to find handsome, witty, and personable. As Mary Baker Eddy counseled in her Science and Health, human affection is not poured forth vainly, even though it meet no return, for love supports the struggling heart until it ceases to sigh over the world and begins to unfold its wings for heaven. Marjorie's own father had left her mother for a much younger woman, a betrayal that she could scarcely comprehend, and one that would gnaw at her all her life. She had idolized her father, and he had let her down precipitously. And while she knew what treachery men were capable of, it seemed she could not do without one. Perhaps she thought she could change the leopard spots by the sheer force of her will, which was considerable. Or perhaps she felt secretly unworthy, preordained to relive her punishment time and time again. On the way down the aisle during her first marriage, to a man seemingly above her station, she had heard a dismissive remark from a member of the groom's family. "Sweet enough, given where she comes from," was the gist of it, and she vowed then and there to make the speaker eat those words, however long it might take. But whatever the reasons, the defenses she erected to shield herself from Ned Hutton's infidelities would finally crumble. Mrs. Eddy counseled, "The nuptial vow should never be annulled, so long as its moral obligations are kept intact." But ultimately, Marjorie determined that her husband's unwillingness to forsake all others did in fact demand dissolution of their union. She would divorce him, but given that they were residents of New York, there could be no other grounds. She would need proof of his adultery. Suspecting he was dallying with a newly hired French maid, Marjorie tied threads across the threshold of a doorway separating the maid's chambers from Hutton's bedroom. When that plan failed, she hit on a scheme that her gadget-inclined father might have approved. A set of lead plates and pulleys rigged to Hutton's bed and designed to ring a bell if the weight of two bodies was pressing vigorously on his mattress. But the clang of the bell never came. Another woman might have decided to let well enough alone, but Marjorie was not one to waver. During their stay at Mar-a-Lago for the season of 1935, Marjorie took her husband's valet aside one morning and asked that he give the silk sheets of the master's bed a good dusting with talcum powder when the room was made up. Then, for good measure, she again went to fix a pair of slender threads across the threshold that divided the maid's room from her husband's. That afternoon, when Ned Hutton seemed nowhere to be found, and the attractive young maid could not be summoned for a "Oui, oui, madame," Marjorie made her way to her husband's chambers and pulled open the door. As to what she saw when the door swung open, court records detailing Ned Hutton's fierce denial of Marjorie's accusations remain sealed to this day. If she in fact found what she wished for, those threshold threads sundered, ghostly pairs of powdered footprints at his bedside, or something more salacious, we will never know. All we can be sure of is that on September 7th, 1935, following a shuttered hearing in a judge's chambers on Long Island, Marjorie's complaint was upheld. She was granted her request for divorce from E.F. Hutton on the grounds of adultery. She was freed, and a meteoric era in Palm Beach had come to an end. 1. Nouveau riche. On May 25, 1914, about 2 weeks after its writer had dressed himself in his Sunday finest, laid himself down in the master bedroom of his Santa Barbara mansion, and blown off the top of his head with a hunting rifle, the will of serial magnate C.W. Post was filed for probate in Washington, D.C. On the following day, the New York Times reported details, noting that Post's widow and second wife, Layla, would receive something less than half of the $20 million estate, with the lion's share going to his daughter, Marjorie Post Close. Post's first wife, Ella, whom he divorced in 1904, had died in 1912. That bequest might have seemed bounteous enough for Mrs. Close, then 27, but a follow-up Times story painted an even rosier picture. The estate had, in actuality, been found to be worth $33 million, the Times reported, and the second Mrs. Post, a former plant employee whom Post had married shortly after his divorce, had agreed to a $6 million settlement for her share, ceding daughter Marjorie the remaining $27 million and total control of the Post cereal empire. There is no trouble between Mrs. Close and myself, Layla Post told reporters. I think too much of my late husband to have any differences with his daughter. No doubt, $6 million to a former factory secretary had a way of smoothing over any differences, but in any event, the settlement made Marjorie Merriweather Close, née Post, one of America's most wealthy and influential women on the instant, vaulting her into a prominence and a place of significance traditionally reserved for balding mutton choppers in the waning years of the Republic's Gilded Age. In truth, however, Marjorie Post was neither an ordinary daughter of privilege nor a typical child of her time. As the only offspring of the eccentric C.W. Post, who had morphed a struggling Battle Creek, Michigan health spa into a Leviathan food company purveying the coffee substitute Postum and the breakfast cereal Post Toasties, she in essence became a substitute for the son he never had. From her preteen years, he included her in board meetings and furthermore encouraged her to voice her opinions on matters of importance, often quizzing her on various business decisions to be made. Biographer William Wright recounts the story of a tearful Marjorie coming home one day to tell her father that a local tough had pushed her down as she crossed a vacant lot. "Well, we will see about that," the elder Post replied, dragging his daughter out the door. If Marjorie thought they were headed for a confrontation with the boy's parents, however, she was wrong. C.W. took her to the local gym, where he told a trainer what had happened. "She needs boxing lessons," the cereal magnate said, and left his daughter to the task. The next time the tough threatened Marjorie, she delivered a fabled uppercut that put an end to those depredations. She and her father went hunting, shopped, and traveled the world together, and when Post lost his final battle with the recurring depression that had sent him to a Battle Creek sanatorium in the first place, Marjorie Post Close, at 33, was well prepared to take over what was one of the country's most successful business enterprises. Those steel barons or manufacturers of automobiles might turn up their noses at the idea of cereal as a product of substance, Post's millions spent just as nicely as theirs, and the prospect of minding an empire tending to the physical well-being and gustatory pleasures of the Republic would prove a natural fit for the outgoing, other-oriented Marjorie. Post had also left another valuable legacy to his daughter, one that would be the perfect complement to her business acumen. Money was made to be spent, according to C.W., and in doing so, she should trust no one's advice but her own. In order to achieve wise counsel, then, she would have to acquire the necessary knowledge herself. It was advice that stayed with Marjorie all her life, leading to an autodidact's approach to art history, shipbuilding, jewelry making, antiques, and much more. C.W., however, did not extend his warnings to cover her choices in men. At the time when Marjorie began to transform from a precocious preteen into an attractive young woman, things had begun to change in the Post's Battle Creek household. In 1901, as Marjorie was turning 14, C.W. had begun to look for ways to extend the reach of his business empire and lead his adopted city into prominence. That year saw him open the 6-story, 135-room Post Tavern, billed as the finest hotel between Chicago and Detroit, and soon afterward he added an office building and a theater to his downtown complex. Young Marjorie was pressed into service as a hostess at the Post Theater's grand opening, delivering a rose to each lady seated in the boxes. Gossip had it that there was something more than a professional relationship between C.W. and his opening night headliner, comic actress Maxine Elliott. But whatever the truth about that relationship, it was widely known that Marjorie's mother, Ella, was spending more and more time away from home, traveling for her health, according to the newspapers. Though Marjorie's Aunt Molly, married to C.W.'s brother Carol, had stepped in as a surrogate mother, her father remained at the center of her world. And yet, for all his doting, as a man of his day, C.W. Post was scarcely fit to discuss matters of the heart with an impressionable teenager, especially when his own marriage was considerably strained. The matter came to a head when, during one of his wife's tours of Europe, C.W. began an affair with Layla Young, a 22-year-old secretary working at his company, whom he promptly installed as a paid companion to young Marjorie. Compounding the awkwardness, C.W. in 1902 pulled up stakes in Battle Creek to take up residence in Washington, D.C., where he installed Marjorie in a private boarding school while he stepped up his work lobbying on behalf of anti-labor legislation and other business ventures. Though Marjorie's mother would follow, she would set up a separate residence in the city. According to biographer Nancy Rubin, American Empress, C.W. was not above putting his daughter in the middle of the difficulties between him and his wife, often complaining that he had no idea where Ella might be found, and beseeching Marjorie to pass along mail and messages to her mother. At the same time, he began work on the construction of a new home in Greenwich, Connecticut, to be known as the Boulders, which would serve as a suitably magnificent domicile for an American business titan and his daughter. Though the Boulders would not be completed until 1905, C.W. grew weary of his drear relationship with Ella, and in 1904 filed for divorce. In a rather remarkable speech delivered to his Battle Creek employees at a testimonial dinner shortly after his remarriage in November of that year, C.W. spoke openly about the dissolution. "When scarcely out of our teens, the first Mrs. Post and I were married, and in less than a year found a childish mistake had been made." Post announced this to the gathering, then went on to say that the couple soon after their marriage decided to live apart for much of the time, though they would keep up appearances in public. His wife's absences and the demands of his own business meant that young Marjorie would have to spend too much time alone, however, and for that reason, Post said, he sought out a companion for his daughter. Not a housekeeper, Post said, but a companion that would see that she was warm, comfortable, and contented. The search for such a person led him to Layla Young, Post explained, and though she was originally employed some 5 years previously to come daily at noon and stay through the dinner hour, it soon became convenient for him to promote her to a position as his assistant, tending to correspondence, the preparation of his speeches, travel arrangements, and the like. Layla became a virtual member of the family, Post said, before adding, "During those days, my friends, I caught glimpses of what a peaceful, contented home might be, if nature happened to supply the members of the home circle with temperaments that harmonized." 5 years of such glimpses had led him to dissolve a loveless bond, Post declared, adding that he had settled a trust fund on his first wife, the income for life being enough yearly to keep a dozen families, and sufficient to indulge her desire to travel to any limit. "She is happy and contented, and we have had no occasions for the usual acrimonious contentions customary in separation," Post asserted. "On the contrary, I frequently hear of the kind expressions from her, and I have a steady and profound regard for the many sterling qualities of her character." Unexpected as it had to have been, Post's address to his employees would end on an even more astonishing note. "The public generally seems to think a man of means should marry a wealthy society woman, and the so-called society paper that criticized me rather sneered at the fact that I married a new wife that was a poor girl and earned a living as my secretary, and the fact that she ever worked seems to trouble it," he said, before finishing with a flourish. "I can't imagine what use I would have for a society pet that would drag an old workhorse around nights to social functions and make him listen to the drool about the latest kind of necktie, cut of riding pants, and all the tiresome stuff the dudes feed on." Though Post might have hoped this remarkable public confession would absolve him in the eyes of the world, and whatever its effects in that quarter, subsequent events suggest that it did not have an entirely salutary effect on his daughter. Previously, and owing to the lack of any real relationship between her father and her mother, not to mention the absence of any troublesome brothers, Marjorie had enjoyed the full attention of her larger-than-life and highly accomplished father. Now, at 17, and despite any assurances to the contrary, she found herself with a rival, if not an actual replacement. As work on the boulders progressed during this period, C.W. and Marjorie made regular inspection trips, often staying over at a Greenwich hotel. On one night in the summer of 1903, a by then voluptuous, attractive, and elegantly dressed 16-year-old Marjorie found herself approached during a dance at the inn by a 21-year-old Columbia Law School student named Edward Bennett Close. Somewhat plump and awkward, Close was no one's idea of a dreamboat, but his pedigree, his father a descendant of the original settlers of Greenwich, his mother a member of the Knickerbocker Brevoorts, was flawless. Within 4 days of their meeting, Close had proposed, and though Marjorie was hardly ready for such a prospect, the gears had been set in motion. As Close persisted, Marjorie's frustration at her father's infatuation with Layla grew apace. "This creature who was only 10 years older than I was," she would later exclaim. When her father remarried, C.W. was 50, Layla 27. In an interview she granted nearly 60 years later, Marjorie well remembered her state of mind. "Did I have a mess on my hands after that? I was furious. I had 27 boils that year. I was wild." By the following spring, Close was graduated from Columbia and again proposed to Marjorie, who, as evidence of her father's betrayal, was sporting a newly appeared vivid streak of white in her hair. At this point, she was 18, graduated from the Mount Vernon School, and primed to begin a life of her own, with $2 million or more of trust funds already in the bank. Edward Close might be no dashing man about town, but he was devoted and comfortably fixed. Furthermore, Marjorie had seen a father she thought she knew and could depend on transform himself virtually without warning in...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?